Welcome back. And now for the news in detail. US President Donald Trump says peace talks with the Taliban have resumed. Trump said he believes the insurgents will probably agree to a ceasefire in Afghanistan. Speaking on his first trip to Afghanistan, Trump said the US is in the process of substantially reducing the number of troops it has deployed there. The Taliban have responded, saying they are ready to restart the peace talks with the United States. Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid said if peace talks start, they will resume from the stage where they were stopped. Trump's Thanksgiving Day visit was his first to Afghanistan since becoming president and came a week after a prisoner swap between Washington and Kabul. For more on this developing story, we are joined by Intizar Khadim, analyst from Kabul. Mr. Intizar, thank you for taking time out for Indus News. First of all, Trump has expressed optimism that the Taliban will agree to a ceasefire. So do you have the similar hopes as well?
Well, yes, I think it was quite a surprise visit to Kabul because no one understood that he would be sweeping to Bagram. President Ashraf Ghani visited him in Bagram, which was a surprise after surprise. We were hoping that he would be visiting President Ghani in the palace, but that was not the case. Anyway, Donald Trump came to Kabul and he was speaking to media with mixed messages. From one side, he was telling stories of the colossus economic and political power of America to the world. After that, he was telling carriage stories of the American soldier who killed Baghdadi. And then he was also telling of the looming crisis security in the region in Afghanistan. And then he was also trying to tell the Taliban leadership that Americans have flexibility to talk to you again and resume that. As Zabihullah Mujahid, the spokesperson of Taliban, asserted that the talk would resume from where it stopped and stalled, I think I'm feeling the same way, but with addition that there could be a revision both from the Taliban side and from the American side, because for the first round, there has been a simple trust, mutual trust between American and Taliban, but there has been slips and a little bit deviation from the promises they made toward each other. This time there could be an addition of two-side promises, which would be guaranteed by guarantors in the region and in the world. So I think that was a surprise visit, and that will have a specific impact on the security issues, election and peace in Afghanistan as well.
Okay, Mr. Intizar, the US was previously inclined to accept a reduction in violence by the Taliban. Has it now adopted President Ashraf Ghani's tougher line of a ceasefire?
Well, I think there should be a reduction in two sectors. There should be reduction in the violences from the Taliban side, and there should be reduction in the forces of the Americans existed in Afghanistan. I think that's interconnected issues. Taliban would be promising in ensuring that there should be a de-escalation of violences from Taliban, including the bomb blast and suicide attacks, and there could be a reduction in attacks and counterattacks between Taliban, the American forces, and also the Afghan government. But at the same time, Taliban would like to assure themselves that if you would like to step back, you have to step back as well. I mean, the Americans should be following the tree balance or the tree sheet of the mutual promises made by two sides. So yes, of course, I believe that. Second is the ceasefire. There is no way, another way or B option without having ceasefire if you would like to ink a deal of peace. But Taliban leadership understand that if they announce a ceasefire and they order their Taliban or foot soldiers in the ground who are fighting for the purpose of Taliban leadership, then that will be the weakness position of Taliban. So they would like to announce a ceasefire when they ensure that the American side will be following their promises as well.
Mr. Intizar, one of the contentious issues out of the 4 points which were discussed during the nine rounds of talks between the Taliban and the US, one was the ceasefire, as you have already described, and the second was the US troops pull out. So do you think Trump is apparently in a hurry to pull out US forces from Afghanistan? As he has mentioned that US is trying to substantially reduce the troops from there, or is there any danger that Trump's electoral priorities could undermine the whole peace process?
One thing which is predictable about Donald Trump, that President Trump is unpredictable. I mean, you can expect anything from Donald Trump to do it, but if there was a pull-out of the troops, if there is an absolute withdrawal of the American soldiers from Afghanistan, I think that will have collateral damage. I'm sure Taliban leadership would like the American soldiers to leave Afghanistan, but they would like to have the presence of Americans in Afghanistan, not for fighting, but for the reconstruction. But because the reconstruction in development scheme of the last 18 years has been a failed practice. For that, there should be a rethink on everything in the future. Second, if Taliban become part of the political spectrum of Afghanistan and there is no follow-up development aid from international community, including the American government, I think that also will drag the peace deal into collapse. The Taliban leadership understands that sensitivity of the peace deal. So yes, if the abrupt pullout happens, it will have a collateral damage. The Taliban leadership, the Afghan government, and also the Afghan nation, not the Afghan government, but particularly the Afghan nation, would like the American forces to get out of their villages, but not get out of their country. Or if I say it, they would like to get out American soldiers from Afghanistan, but they would like to have their presence to ensure stability, democracy, election in the development of the last 18 years.
Mr. Intizar Khadim, thanks for joining us live, analyst from Kabul. We really appreciate that. Now moving on to Iraq, 45 more people have been shot dead during anti-government protests over the past 24 hours. Medics say dozens of others were wounded. 29 demonstrators have been killed in clashes with the security forces in the southern city of Nasiriyah. Thousands of mourners later defied a curfew, taking to the streets to bury their dead after the mass shooting. The latest violence raises the death toll to nearly 400 since protests began last month. Meanwhile, Iran has closed its Mehran border, crossing with Iraq on security grounds, a day after its consulate in Najaf was set on fire. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has approved funding for a fresh probe into chemical attacks in Syria. Russia refused to fund the investigation after its bid to block the body's budget failed. 19 countries, including Russia and China, voted against the budget, while 106 voted in favor. At the annual meeting of the OPCW in The Hague, the US accused Russia of covering up the use of chemical weapons by its Syrian ally. Russian Alexander Shulgin said the majority of member states again chose to ignore the opinion of Moscow and other major non-Western contributors. Syria's government also criticized the move, saying it rejects political blackmail by the US and its Western allies. The Turkish Foreign Minister has rejected criticism from French President Emmanuel Macron of its military operation against Kurdish fighters in Syria. Speaking to reporters in Ankara, Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said the French leader sponsors terrorism. He was referring to Macron's meeting with the Kurdish leader last month in Paris. Earlier, Macron said Ankara could not expect support from NATO after its offensive in Syria. Speaking alongside NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in Paris, Macron said he stands by his claim the alliance is experiencing a brain death. Macron says his statement was meant as a wake-up call. He said member states lack cooperation on the key issues facing the alliance. Meanwhile, Stoltenberg says NATO's foundations are strong and will continue to modernize. After almost 7 weeks of anti-government protests, Lebanon's economy is on the brink of collapse. Fearing mass withdrawals, banks have restricted access to dollars while prices have risen. Amid the crisis, thousands of young Lebanese are faced with joblessness and financial ruin. This report describes their options.
Weeks into Lebanon's ongoing anti-government protests, interior architect Letitia Nicholas was called in by her boss and told she was fired.
At the end of the month, they spoke to me and asked me to come to the office. And there was a check waiting. It became clear there was no longer going to be a part-time for part salary. And that's it. The office is not going to continue like before.
Letitia's story is a common one in Lebanon today. Although the government is blaming protesters for the economic turbulence, protesters say the economy has been decaying for years. This is just one of the reasons they give for their refusal to leave the streets. But not all young people are protesting for change. Many simply want to leave the country.
I have already applied to a number of companies abroad, not in Lebanon, in the Gulf. In Lebanon, there aren't any opportunities.
Unemployment among young Lebanese is already above 30%. Meanwhile, Lebanese banks are warning of even bleaker times ahead.
The subject is, of course, really upsetting for me, because everything I have built over these years is collapsing in front of me.
According to figures from the World Bank, around a third of Lebanon's population lives in poverty. The body is warning this figure could rapidly increase in the future, something that will only fuel the country's youthful exodus.
The OIC has called for an international probe into human rights violations, including serious genocide alerts in Indian-occupied Kashmir. The Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission said it is appalled by the New Delhi's unending, inhumane blockade of the valley. In a statement after its 16th meeting in Jeddah, the Commission strongly condemned India's use of pellet guns, arbitrary arrests and extrajudicial killings. The group agreed to conduct an independent case study into the use of pellet guns in occupied Kashmir. In a stern warning, the group said these systematic violations amount to ethnic cleansing and genocide. The Commission urged the international community to pressurize India to cease its human rights violations. Indian-occupied Kashmir has been under a lockdown and communications blackout for the past 117 days. Pakistan and China will stage a joint maritime exercise in the Arabian Sea in January. China's Ministry of National Defense says the drill was scheduled under the annual military exchange plan between the two countries. Speaking in Beijing, spokesman Ren Guoxiang said China will send destroyers, frigates, supply ships and submarine rescue ships. Ren said the military drill does not target any third party. He said the exercise aims to deepen security cooperation between close allies China and Pakistan and promote maritime safety. It's time for a short break, but coming up next in the bulletin. Children too tech-savvy for their own good. And African NGO will put floating slum on map. Welcome back. North Korea has confirmed it successfully tested a super large multiple launch rocket system yesterday. State media says Kim Jong-un expressed great satisfaction with the results of the test firing. It said the launch was meant to examine the combat applications of the new system and assess its technical capability. South Korea's foreign ministry said its chief nuclear envoy held telephone talks with the US and Japanese counterparts after the launch. Earlier, Washington and Tokyo said Pyongyang should avoid provocation and abide by the UN Security Council resolutions. Cuba's foreign minister claims the US is violating the island's historic 2015 agreement by interfering in the country's internal affairs. Bruno Rodriguez said the US embassy in Havana was engaged in illegal activity intended to attack the constitutional order. Rodriguez said the US violated the Vienna Convention, the agreement for the re-establishment of relations, as well as Cuban and US laws. It was the second time in a week the communist government has accused US diplomats of provoking dissent. Cuba's relations with the US broke off in 1961 and were only partially restored in the 1980s. After taking office, President Donald Trump said he opposed the warming of relations between both the countries. He called on Cuba to end its support for Nicolas Maduro's government in Venezuela and reform its own political system. Uruguay's conservative opposition party has claimed victory at the end of the official vote counting for Sunday's presidential election. The ruling board front candidate conceded defeat to the center-right National Party. The opposition National Party announced on social media its candidate, Luis Lacalle Pou, had won the election. Moments later, Daniel Martinez of the ruling board front party conceded defeat via a tweet. In a region undergoing political upheaval, Uruguay's swing to the right marks a shift in the agricultural South American nation. The NATO is celebrating 70 years since it was brought into existence in 1949. NATO was first created as a means of defense against the Soviet Union. The 26-nation regional defense alliance aims to enhance stability of its members through a system of collective security. Though the alliance now has 26 members, it started with just 12. Major NATO members include countries such as the US, the UK, Germany, France, and Belgium. NATO's headquarters is in the Belgian capital of Brussels. The European Parliament has declared a climate emergency in a symbolic vote ahead of the UN Global Crisis Summit. The resolution was passed with 429 lawmakers in favor, while 225 went against it. The motion urges the Commission to ensure that all legislative and budgetary proposals are aligned to limit global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius. The Parliament has also urged the EU to submit its strategy to reach climate neutrality as soon as possible. The lawmakers called on EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to include a 55% emissions reduction target by 2030. Speaking in the EU Parliament yesterday, von der Leyen said Europe must lead the world in the fight against climate change. The European Space Agency has been given a budget of nearly $16 billion to expand its operations over the next 5 years. Funding for the agency's space program was approved by ministers from 22 member states at a 2-day meeting in Spain. ESA Director General Jan Warner said the amount is more than the agency expected. He said most of the budget is committed to the ESA's Copernicus program, a group of satellites that measure the status of the planet. The ESA's budget is dwarfed by America's funding for NASA, which is on track to spend $19.5 billion this year. Children around the world are becoming tech-savvy at an increasingly early age, but psychologists warn the excessive use of mobile devices is leading to mental health problems in young people. This can be seen in Indonesia, where pediatrics wards are flooded with tech-addicted children. This report has the details.
Smartphones, tablets, and computers can be productive tools. But the compulsive use of these devices can interfere with work and school. Eventually, it can lead to serious mental health problems. This can be seen in the Indonesian city of Bogor, which has a growing number of people struggling with tech addiction. This includes children. Psychologist Ira Savitri says smartphone addicts in Bogor's hospital make up 25% of all pediatric patients. She says the patients match the criteria they look for.
Addiction to devices had been included in the diagnostic criteria. So addiction to gadgets is considered a psychological disorder. The signs of gadget addictions include using a device up to 20 hours a day.
One patient's father claims his son loses his temper when his internet quota is finished.
He would play games until 11 or 12 p.m. That was going on for 2 months. He would break a plate if he doesn't get the internet quota.
An increasing number of psychologists say the excessive use of mobile devices is causing mental problems in children. They recommend parents should spend more time building closer and better relationships with their children.
In Nigeria, an African NGO is working to literally put Lagos's floating slums on the map using geolocation technology. The group's volunteers are navigating the slums' waterways to make a map they hope will improve the lives of the people living there.
Welcome to Makoko, a floating slum in the Nigerian megacity of Lagos. Officially, this part of the city does not exist. You won't find these dingy canals and ramshackle huts indicated on any city maps. But John and his team are trying to change that. Armed with their location tracking smartphones, they crisscross these waterways with the aim of putting Makoko and its approximately 300,000 inhabitants on the map.
We can have multi-layers of points of interest on this map. So we can see the streets and have easy navigation, and all of this can be on the map for free.
John works for South Africa-based NGO Code for Africa, the organisation behind this drive to map out the slum and improve the lives of those who live here. Every point of interest is carefully entered into the system, like Watanabo, a floating barber shop.
So we are putting your barbing salon on the map. Yeah, to be part of the points of interest that people will see. When they look at Makoko map, they will see Watanabo.
John believes that the inhabitants of this part of the city should have access to the same knowledge of their neighbourhood enjoyed by those who live elsewhere in Lagos. The public will now be able to see this neighbourhood differently, as the map is ready to go online.
Lows on the highs of the business world now. Stock markets across Asia have slipped on concerns about deteriorating relations between the US and China. Investors fear Trump's approval of a law supporting anti-government protesters in Hong Kong could torpedo trade talks between the US and China. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index shed over 2% after shares of tech giant Tencent dropped nearly 2.5%. Seoul's Kospi is trading over 1% lower after the Bank of Korea left its benchmark interest rate unchanged. Shares of industrial heavyweight Samsung Electronics are down almost 2%. The Shanghai Composite has also shed nearly 1% on expectations that Chinese manufacturing activity contracted for the 7th straight month in November. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 is also trading about 0.5% lower. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.